So we are ready. We are ready to go. Feel free to start.
Okay, hi everyone. We are today with Dr. Brent Steele. Uh, Voy a presentarlo en español then I will change to English. El profesor Dr. Brent Steele es titular de la Cátedra Presidencial Francis del Wormont, profesor distinguido de Ciencias Políticas de la Universidad de Utah. Ha sido coeditor jefe de Global Studies Quarterly, revista de la Asociación de Estudios Internacionales (ISA), desde su creación en 2020. Antes de mudarse a Utah, trabajó en la Universidad de Kansas de 2005 a 2013 y es autor de varios libros y varios artículos en diversas revistas, ¿no? Entre ellos está, por ejemplo, Vicarious Identity, the International Relations, que es una publicación de la Universidad de Oxford. Con Chris Brauer y Patty Jones, publicó un libro sobre la cuestión ontológica de la Universidad de Cambridge, ¿no? Sus artículos más recientes han aparecido en The Australian Journal of International Affairs y el Journal de Global Security Studies. Imparte cursos sobre política exterior estadounidense, ética internacional y relaciones internacionales. So, the floor is yours, Brent.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you all for being here, wherever you are. We know that there's a lot of different platforms that this is streaming and being broadcast on, and it's an honor to be here. I want to thank AMEI, Isaac Flores, Dr. Luis Miguel Morales, and all of you for being here. It's an honor for me to be here. I'm going to try to share my screen. Hopefully it will pick up my PowerPoint, and I'll get my PowerPoint ready to go here to provide a little bit of a background to what it is that I am doing. Sorry. So today what I was gonna do is, can you see the PowerPoint okay? Can I get a thumbs up from some? Okay, great. Isaac, is it okay? ¿Está bien?
Yes.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
absolutely great.
Okay, thank you. And my apologies, I'm doing this in English. Mi español es muy mal. I get by a little bit when I'm traveling, but unfortunately, I didn't retain the Spanish that I was trained in when I was in high school. My brother is fluent in Spanish, but he doesn't. He's not an academic, so I apologize that I'm using English. Um, so today I'd like to provide a couple of contributions regarding ontological security studies. First, an introduction and history of ontological security studies as a research community in international relations. And I'll focus on some basic concepts of ontological security, how it's kind of developed within international relations, and then provide, because I know that we might have some students here, those that are curious about ontological security. I'd like to provide a kind of a basic research design that they can use for applying it, and then some criticisms that ontological security studies has faced over time and how it's kind of evolved since then. And second, I will, so maybe I'm actually doing three things. Second, I also included a little bit because I know we have some practitioners here. And so those that are policymakers, security experts, maybe mention a little bit about some considerations when it comes to applying ontological security or being aware of ontological security as a lens within the security field. I don't have any specific recommendations, but more of just some considerations related to the basic concepts of ontological security studies that we use in international relations. And then third, and finally, I'll just kind of give a quick overview of the book, which Dr. Morales, I think, provided and made available to anybody who wanted to read it in case that prompts some discussion. My goal here is to only go about 25, maybe 30 minutes at the most, so that we have plenty of time for discussion because I know that we have an hour total. So to give a little bit of a background and an overview of ontological security, and it can be a lot, it can be a mouthful to mention. So let me try to very carefully walk through what ontological security means. If we think about ontology, ontology refers to the nature of being. So if we combine ontology with ontological security explores what it means to be secure. One way in which I explain this to my undergraduates when they're first coming into contact with ontological security is to think about security and to say, well, when we think about international security, usually what we're thinking about is a very narrow understanding of national security, physical security, traditional security, power-based interests that relate to a nation state's goals in foreign policy. But if we think about an individual being insecure, it has a little bit of a different meaning, and that's closer to where ontological security goes with our understanding of security. It's defined as the securing of self through time and space. Both Ronald Lang in the 1960s and then Anthony Giddens in the 1980s and 1990s developed this. They developed it from, in Lang's case, because he worked with in psychiatry and psychology, focusing on individuals. Anthony Giddens, because he's a sociologist, looked at ontological security as being caught up in institutions, organizations, and the broader epoch of late modernity. So it kind of is approached from the psychological and sociological ends. Ontological security studies then refers to the community of IR scholars that are interested in investigating the politics of identity in global politics. Ontological security has provided insights into a variety of emotions that have been studied within the research community and then outside of it, such as anxiety, shame, rage, boredom, trauma, fear, and revenge. Both Lang and Giddens, again, as the sort of founders of the concept or of the original concept, looked at the skills that are necessary to create this securing of the self through time and space, this ordering of the self through time and space. So these include at least four what have come to be known as ordering devices in ontological security studies. First, routines, which are a pattern across time and space for a subject. They give, as Giddens said, they are supporting and supported by a sense of ontological security. So if we think at the everyday level, how important routines are, especially as we get older and the world becomes a little bit more disorienting to us, getting up and having a routine can help make the world seem a little bit more manageable and make ourselves seem a little bit more orderly. Second, narratives of the self. These are, as Giddens defined them, story or stories by means of which self-identity is reflexively understood. A self-narrative, an autobiographical narrative is often what these are termed. Third, the acquisition of expert knowledge or knowledge derived from expert systems. These, according to Giddens, deploy means of and modes of technical knowledge so that social relations themselves can be consulted or a form of being instructed by experts and expert systems of knowledge. I'll come back to this in a couple of different moments in this talk. And then a fourth device or practice, which has been kind of developed over the last few years, and I've been a part of some of this work, that's shaped especially when those three or any of those three kind of fall short of providing us that sense of ontological security, is something titled vicarious identity. This is something that Chris Browning, 𝒏𝒕𝒐𝒍𝒐𝒈𝒊𝒂𝒍 and I defined as processes through which subjects gain a sense of self-identity, purpose, status, and self-esteem by living through others. And this is something that happens at the everyday level, but we haven't really applied it that much in international relations. We do it through children, sometimes our own children. We do it through sports teams. And then we argue that this happens at the level of international relations as well. So what is I guess before we get into the development of this in international relations, what is the kind of the purchase of ontological security? It's that I think it radically expands our understanding of security by both incorporating the critical security studies maxim of whose security we're referring to, so that we can look at this at a bunch of different levels, and what security means to those subjects. So this is a little bit of a different type of inquiry, a little bit more comfortably situated within interpretive methodologies, where we're looking at the meanings created by subjects rather than necessarily pure cause and effect. The search for ontological security is less easily resolved by international actors than understandings of security that reference measurable power-based interest. So security dilemmas, for instance, emerge not only because of concerns for physical security, like arms races, for instance, but because of uncertainty, and because of dangerous routines that provide ontological security. So it could be the case that we're in a routine that provides us ontological security, but it makes us more physically insecure. If I could get to a little bit of a background or a little bit of an overview of the development of ontological security studies as a research community. I mentioned the development in other fields, in psychiatry, psychology, and then sociology. There are also philosophical influences that you can actually see in some of this work as well. Existentialist concerns over what is the meaning of life, what is the meaning of our own agency, notions of anxiety and dread drawn from Heidegger and Kierkegaard. In international relations, the 1990s and early 2000s had interventions by constructivist scholars, post-structuralist scholars, feminist scholars as well, who were increasingly focused on identity and how it shapes international practices. And it was really in this context that myself, Katarina Schindball, and Jennifer Mitzen started to do our first interventions in international relations and applying the insights of ontological security, specifically situating it in international relations. And so this included my book that you all were provided and we can return to shortly in the Q&A. So by the 2010s, a small but significant group of scholars after this period of time were starting to work on ontological security and international relations and really applying it to a wide variety of topics, including security communities, foreign policy analysis, peace and conflict resolution, memory politics, or what would become known as a sort of substrand of this research community known as mnemonical security, the way in which memory and memories of history and historical events shape the present and the future. It's also been applied to migration and the securitization of migration. And that's just a small selection of what it was applied to in this period of time in the 2010s. This was also a period of time when there were critiques of the sort of first wave of works, including my own, which I'll talk about here in a second in terms of the different critiques of ontological security that are out there, and then how those have been or not responded to. In the 2020s, there's been a wave of scholarship in this decade that might be characterized using William Auden's 1947 poem title of Working Within an Age of Anxiety. So this is a period of time where the central role of anxiety as a concept within ontological security studies has been developed, but then also the world out there seems like is generating a lot of anxiety as well, including the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of epistemic, but also counter-epistemic communities, the continued rise, fall, and then rise again of populist movements, historic transnational protests, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, continued climate crisis, the rise of big tech and artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. And so the focus here in ontological securities is reflecting the importance of anxiety at all levels, not just individual anxiety, but group anxiety, collective anxiety, maybe even systemic anxiety, to the point where some of the most ambitious statements in this last few years have been arguing that international politics is not very well characterized, global politics nowadays is not very well characterized necessarily by anarchy or hierarchy, but anxiety. Anxiety is a constitutive condition of late modernity. And I can talk a little bit about that as well. Beyond this specific focus on anxiety, there's been a lot of additional interventions in this decade, including a focus on race, more embodied theorizations of ontological security. This isn't just separating the mind from the body, but also the body caught up within that. And then detailed refinements and reformulations of routines. Routines are important, they're an ordering device, but the meaning in which they are invested isn't quite captured by the concept of routines as a sort of technical organization. Rather, additional concepts like rituals and rhythms have been used to refine some of these original concepts. This has led across most of these studies to what we refer to as a typical ontological security study research design. I'm working on a joint project with Katarina Schindvall and Jennifer Mitzen, as we've seen kind of how ontological security studies has developed. And in this project, we think that one of the ways in which this could make even ontological security even more applicable is to develop a typical research design based on, this is sort of inductive. This is based on like the way in which ontological security has been applied by a lot of the studies that we have seen over the last 15 to 20 years. So it includes a number of steps. First, a researcher explores a general puzzle, such as how can we understand, for instance, the seeming rise of populism? And then second, what you need to do is make a decision regarding the theorization of the subject. So like I mentioned, there are different influences in terms of our conceptualization and understanding of ontological security, but sometimes there are distinctions across those. So would we use Ronald Lang's work? Would we use Anthony Giddens's work? Would we, as we've increasingly seen over the last 10 to 15 years, but this was always a hallmark of Katarina Schindvall's work, theorize it via Lacan, Jacques Lacan's work, that ontological security itself is a fantasy that can never be achieved, but in the hopes and the ache to try to achieve it, we see a lot of particular processes that ultimately generate insecurity. So that second step is important in terms of, is it a Lacanian, a Giddensian, a Langian, or something else, Kleinian, for instance, understanding of how you're theorizing the subject of ontological security. And then related to that, you specify the subject or subject. So this is whose ontological security or insecurity we're examining, precisely because it can be applied, not without controversy, can be applied to a variety of levels. This would be a step that is important in terms of specifying who it is that you're talking about in relation to other drives for ontological security. This is also important methodologically in terms of where to look for the data, whether it's narratives, routines, or whatever. And then also politically as well, because if we are choosing and specifying a particular subject over others, that's not just a methodological choice, that's not just a theoretical choice, that's also a political choice in terms of prioritizing certain drives of ontological security over others. Then, fourth, you would delineate the key concepts. Are you talking about narratives? Are you talking about routines? Are you talking about expertise? Are you talking about something else, like a modification of those? And then what it is, putting it in relation to steps 3 and step 5, what it is that constitutes a narrative or a routine or a critical situation, which is how ontological security scholars theorize disruptions or shocks. Fifth, the empirics. If there is going to be an empirical study, what will the case illustration be? What will the study involve? There's increasingly more and more and more interviews being used as a method, relational interviewing with subjects on the ground in ontological security studies. In fact, I think that it's probably become one of the more popular methods for being able to seek out where these struggles over ontological security are happening. In my ontological security book that you all were provided, the way in which I kind of specify the cases is I talk about temporal and spatial parameters, but really all I'm talking about there, or was talking about there, was when the case begins, when it ends, making a justification for the start time and end time of that, what I'm looking for within that, and then the spatial parameters, whose like narratives I'm going to be looking at versus others, and justifying that as well. And then finally, and this is something that ontological security studies was increasingly pressed to consider roughly around 10 years ago, consider the ethical and political implications as well. So ontological security studies has been, I think, one of its successes has been being able to provide at least a powerful analytical story regarding certain things that seem to otherwise be somewhat puzzling, but it hasn't necessarily talked about what we do with that. And so that's why a couple of the slides that I have here suggest ways in which policymakers, practitioners, or even scholars themselves can speak to this and even act upon it. So some different debates that have developed in ontological security studies. One of the earliest ones was where agents or subjects draw from when it comes to sources for their ontological security or insecurity. And so the debate here was really focusing on those ends of the spectrum in that second slide that I provided a little bit earlier. Are individuals shaped more about their own memories, their own narratives of themselves? Their self's work on the self is what Foucault might call it. Are they shaped a little bit more by the social setting, the community setting, or organizations and institutions? In my book, you can see, like, I think I have pages 58 to 60. I'm distinguishing between my account and Professor Mitson's at that same time about 20 years ago. Hers was a little bit more focused on the sociological aspects. I was much more caught up in psychological and psychoanalytical aspects. Zarakal called this an agent structure debate over, is it the more individual psychological processes or the more sociological features that shape ontological security? But really, this has become less of a debate and more a better way to just organize different ontological security studies as more and more studies have developed. Second has been the levels of analysis issue. This was always something that the ontological security scholars have to deal with. How do you justify the ascription of individual level processes to collectives? This was also a period of time, for those that might remember it, of about 20 to 25 years ago when there was a big debate over the state as person. Alexander Wendt had kind of fostered this in some of his work, and it developed into some forums and some roundtable discussions. This was in that context in which both, especially Professor Mitson and I, were doing our work in terms of justifying the application of ontological security, which was first studied in individuals by R.D. Laing, to groups, states, collectives, and so on. So I try to resolve that, or I try at least speak to it in 2008 on those pages in the book that you were providing. Third was the feminist critique. And this emerged in kind of fits and starts over the first 15 to 20 years of ontological security studies. But it's not just that you're structuring understandings of the self related to honor, related to the integrity of the self, related to the community, but that there are masculinized understandings that are there that need to be considered. So adding a gendered lens to the social construction of the self is something that feminist scholars call out. And so Laura Schoberg in her 2012 article calls out the Belgian case in my book as completely ignoring, in my rendering of it, some gendered understandings of why Belgium might be just fine, or not necessarily just fine, but feel like it's going to sacrifice its physical security so that its ontological security as a neutral power can be upheld. There are some masculinized notions that are related there that needed to be addressed that I didn't, that she pointed out I should have, and she was right. And there's been some continued feminist interventions here, including with a study that was just published in Review of International Studies this year. One of the early critiques that really hasn't been resolved completely is whether the fundamental theorization of the subject of ontological security of a self is uniquely Western or perhaps colonial, or is it a late modern assumption? So it is just a specific assumption that is nevertheless universalized to all subjects. There's been different ways in which this has been responded to. There's been a lot of work in post-colonial journals and on post-colonial applications of ontological security studies. One of the interesting, I think, creative applications here in this respect was Marcos Vieira's work on Brazil, and having an additional layer of an ambiguous self because of the vestiges of colonialism in a modern sort of sovereign state context beyond independence. And then finally, ethics or the politics of ontological security analyses. Because the earlier studies were focusing on what generates ontological security, did that privilege certain forms of ontological security against others? Did it actually have a conservative bias so that it privileged the collective's ontological security as opposed to individuals, for instance? So we can see this every day in the struggles over migration. A collective sense of ontological security over what a community should be, regardless of what routines, narratives, searchings for the self, and searching for ontological security individuals that are seeking to be part of a community might have. And so there's an ethical issue here that's also been responded to. So this is, if I can move to just a couple of slides regarding the application of ontological security in practice or policy settings, it really has been a much more sort of theoretical and analytical endeavor. So you haven't seen as much application, but if we think about, how this matters to policymakers or how it might matter to policymakers, folks like me that have mainly done this at an analytical level, have to consider, two of the originators of the concept are themselves or were themselves very practically focused. So R.D. Laing was a psychiatrist who was kind of a countercultural psychiatrist in the sense that he didn't do what was the norm in the 50s and 60s of using shock therapy and institutionalization and some of these other things with his patients. He created Kingsley Hall, which was a community in which patients and clinicians lived together, a little bit more freedom and autonomy for the patients themselves that he saw. And so he actually saw this as caught up in an ethos of a practical sort of application of understanding ontological security. And Anthony Giddens at the sociological, but especially the political level, in the 1990s advised the third way politics in the UK. And so if you just go to the Wikipedia page on third way politics in the UK and Britain in the 1990s, he's right there. He's front and center as one of the sort of founding members or consultants for this group. So they have thought about ontological security, both of them, in the context of what it is that they not only think about, but practice. And so if we're going to think about applying this in an international relations security policy context, a couple of things are important. One is the notion of reflexivity. The principle of reflexivity and the notion of reflexivity and the concept have a lot of different meanings. So they can mean a lot of different things. But really in ontological security, it's taken on a little bit of an ethical understanding that what makes us different in terms of studying human processes from the physical and natural sciences is what we theorize, what we do actually impacts what we study. It's something that Giddens called the double hermeneutic, that there's a constant feedback loop between who we are in our ivory towers or wherever we are and what it is that we're studying out there. And so that's something to consider. And it's something that a lot of policymakers, I think, already know. It's not like they're just taking an intellectual sort of set of guidance and then they're applying it without necessarily thinking about the consequences. They are, but it's still something to consider and to focus on. Second is that a lot of practitioners, policymakers, security experts are part of this ordering device, especially in Giddens's work, of expert systems of knowledge. So that's important. That's also important then if we're thinking about how security is involved at every single level, at the level of routines and narratives. When we are giving advice, when we are trying to impact policy, whose routines are we acknowledging are most important? Whose routines are we serving with that expert advice and whose might we be upending? So if you think about after a terrorist attack and all of the reorientation and restructuring of routines, of standard operating procedures, that can be very dislocating. And so just thinking about that, even if it's necessary, I think is important. And that also has ontological security dynamics. And whose narratives do we privilege over others? Is it policymakers? Is it political leaders? Is it particular groups? Is it legislators, or is it individuals that we come into contact with? All of these things I think are important. And ontological security scholars themselves have actually impacted, especially in the level of memory politics. I've done a couple of papers on the relationship between memory with Professor Schinval and Mitzen on the relationship between memory and ontological security. There have been a couple of folks that have done a lot of work on memory, but they've also sought to kind of impact, or their work has impacted that which they study. Jelena Subotic, for instance, does this work on mnemonical security and the way in which memorials and memorial spaces impact our understanding of not just today, but like what happened in the past. And so she did an article in 2019 that looked at the disappearance of the Yugoslav pavilion at Auschwitz because Yugoslavia didn't exist anymore. And so as a result, the memory of and even the notion of a history of the Holocaust in Yugoslavia completely erased because the memorial wasn't there, was completely erasing what happened to the Jewish population. And so a benefactor read her article and actually then made funds available to restore and reconstruct and return the Yugoslav pavilion to Auschwitz. In a somewhat more intentional way, international ethics scholar Aidan Hahir, and he's on the far left in that theater picture there on your screen. He had a longstanding interest in the Srebrenica massacre from 1995, and so that gave him a couple of, like, two unconventional outputs regarding the memory of that July 1995 event. First, he wrote an illustrated novel, The Flowers of Srebrenica, that was even more recently made, and as you can see it right here, into a theater production, which was performed, and this was the performance in Sarajevo in July 2025 to commemorate the 30th anniversary of the massacre. And then I think there's just also the ways in which, if I can get back to my fellow academics, the ways in which we deal with historically sensitive topics in our classrooms, and how memories also shape the ways in which our students are already engaging those, and pointing out the distinctions between history as something that happened and memory as an account of what we remember happened. And then thinking about the ways in which that relates to identities of not only our students, but also the communities that they're part of. I think we negotiate this. We negotiate ontological security as well. And so I'll kind of conclude with just sort of a setup to the book. For those that didn't read it, for those that did read it, I apologize for the redundancy here. And then I'm running short on time, so I'll hopefully this will give us plenty of food for thought and discussion for what remains in our time. But to give a little bit of background on the book, as with most folks' first book, this was started as my dissertation. In graduate school, I started thinking about ontological security in the early 2000s. While reading Giddens's 1984 and 1999, 1991 books, I was also reading a lot of constructivist work by Nicholas Onuf, especially his World of Our Making. And so I was working on what I thought was going to be a unique approach to the puzzle at the time of humanitarian action, because there were all of these humanitarian interventions in the 1990s, or so we were told, and that was really unusual and couldn't be accounted for by traditional accounts. The concept I kept coming back to was shame in Giddens's work, and how something that may have very little to do with rational incentive structures still impacts the behavior of global political actors. I described it in that 2008 book as a metaphor to understand how identity disconnects can compel states to pursue social actions which sacrifice physical security interests but strengthen ontological security. Shame produces a deep feeling of insecurity. Again, a different understanding of insecurity than we traditionally hold. It's a temporary but radical severance of a state's sense of self. Its presence means that a state recognizes how its actions were or could be incongruent with its sense of self-identity. So ontological security-driven action, because it attempts to change behavior in relation to experience shame, is in some ways self-help behavior, but in a different way than which maybe the realists or the neoliberals would argue. So there's those three cases. First, how U.S. President Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation changed ontologically what the U.S. Civil War meant for Britain, and then made an intervention on behalf of even the Confederacy, or even in between the Confederacy and the U.S. North, a shameful possibility for Britain. The Belgian decision was the second case to reject the German ultimatum in August of 1914, when an acceptance of it would have compromised its self-visions as a neutral power. So it thus literally sacrificed all of its physical security to secure its ontological security. And then finally, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization's members intervening in Yugoslavia or Serbia on behalf of Kosovo. In terms of shame, not related to the present, but each of their own drives of shame over something that had happened in their past. I'll stop there. I'll open it up for discussion, but thanks so much again for inviting me to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Brent. Thank you very much. I see that there are two chapters that are missing that I haven't been able to read, but I will, the last two ones. Okay, voy a dirigirme en español a todas las personas que están conectadas, por si quieren levantar la mano y hacer alguna pregunta al doctor Brent sobre su exposición, sobre lo que ha dicho y ha explicado acerca de la seguridad ontológica. Les recuerdo que el doctor Brent no habla español, entonces le tienen que preguntar en inglés. ¿Alguien?
El
Si me
embajador.
permite, doctor.
Embajador.
Sí, podría. Muchísimas gracias. Thank you, Dr. Steele, for your presentation. It has been useful and educational for me. I'm Marco Antonio García Blanco. I'm retired ambassador of Mexico. I have a question for you. How can we balance, in your opinion, the need to see ourselves as a global citizens in order to face global challenge without losing the necessary national identity that give us a sense of belonging and therefore security? Thank you.
Do you want to take a round of questions or should I answer them one at a time, Dr. Miguel?
Okay, I will ask. ¿Alguien más tiene alguna otra pregunta, comentario? Doctora Andrea, luego Gerardo.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Andrea Olsner. It's where Deborah and I are is very, very hot at the moment, so we're really suffering. Anyway,
It's snowing here right now, just so you know. So I'd be glad to switch places, I think, with you if I could, but no, never mind.
Same. Look, I don't do Fahrenheit, but it's like over 30 Celsius and it's nearly 7 o'clock in the evening now. Anyway, no, mine was a comment more than a question, and it is to do with the fact that I heard of ontological security through also a little bit of an awkward topic that I work on, which is international friendship. And you may have come across the work of Felix Behrenskötter, who uses ontological security to argue that friendship between states and the shared friendship space that they built together helps them stabilize a sense of identity and a sense of self that helps them deal with their ontological security. This is how I arrived to the notion of ontological security, and I find it really most interesting. So thank you very much for your presentation and your book and your research in general.
Muchas gracias, doctora. Seguimos con el maestro Gerardo de la Universidad de las Américas.
Thank you, Professor Luis Miguel, and thank you, Brent. I'm the academic coordinator of the Committee on International Security at AME, and it is a really honor to have you. And my question is related to my areas of interest in research, and is how does the concept of ontological security can help us to explain patterns of international cooperation that cannot be accounted for solely by material interest or rationalist institutionalist theories. That is my issue, that how can ontological security studies help us in cooperation, bilateral or multilateral cooperation? Thank you, Brent.
¿Alguna otra pregunta o comentario? No. Bueno, I have one. In your book, you mentioned that the ontological security approach of making this intelligible, the forms of social action, is threatened by some kind of motives that you mentioned in your chapter, and the reaction can be moral, humanitarian, honor, and well, we are saying that they're going to be a war or something like that. So which of these three, the moral, humanitarian, and honor, is going to be much more important for states to act as an ontological security when they are threat?
Whew. Okay. I will do my best to do even partial justice to these fantastic questions. Ambassador Blanco, thanks so much for the question. Thanks for attending. Thanks for your service as an ambassador. How can we balance seeing ourselves to also, in particular, national context, but also to be citizens of the world, right? In a global community or a global society. I think that's so crucial. And that's like one of the tensions. And that is also one of the analytical interests that ontological security scholars have, because any of these things have to be made and remade, created and recreated. And so we, at an analytical level, we notice the ways in which those are imposed and then reimposed, either through routines or narratives or vicarious identity or whatever. The ways in which they're disrupted as well. And then when it comes to not just nationalism and national context, but also our relationship to the world, you know, I think what happens is a lot of times it happens at a very informal level. Most of my work over the last decade in ontological security studies has been at like the everyday level. So when we go through airports, when we go into other settings, when we go travel, when our students study abroad, when we have faculty exchanges, when we go on vacation, we start to notice all of these little differences at the very everyday level of routines, of narratives, of expert advice. And yet, right, I think, also notice some points in common. And so that's where the work that you had to do, and to some degree are still doing as a citizen of both communities, the world, and then Mexico. I mean, like that's incredibly hard work, but it's also work that is running in tandem with that balance that is being struck by folks who are experiencing this at an everyday level. That is a long way of saying, I think we need, and I don't think it's quite well captured virtually as much as it is in the physical embodied sort of experience. And so that's why we need more, not less, travel, more, not less, access to different countries, including my own, right? I'm in, state of Utah institution, a national institution of University of Utah, but this is a global institution as well. And so at the very least, in my little pond of this place where both of these forms of citizenship are intersecting, I can facilitate that, right? Through conversations, through discussions at very mundane levels. How do you drink your coffee? What kind of coffee do you, these kinds of things I think are very important. And it's an art. It's not a science. I don't think there's a good formula for it, but just being aware of it is important. To some degree, that spectrum that I had on that second slide, that's basically the conundrum that you're talking about. Do we draw from ourselves, from a more particularist, familiar sort of sense, or do we look to the communities and broader communities that we could be a part of for instruction? So I'm not sure if I really answered that. I'm just kind of reflecting in real time that great and I think key question. Professor Olsner, I know your work on friendship, and I know it through Felix as well. And to some degree, it answers a little bit of where Ambassador Blanco's question was coming from, because, that is one way, friendship across different national communities, and then narratives that are narratives of inclusion, narratives of a we, not just a me and not just a you, but a we. Some of that is happening. The routines are happening. The ways in which we acknowledge that we've moved together as friends or as political communities, as they're called, the past, the chosen traumas or the chosen glories, to borrow Vulcan's terminology, that we are thinking about. Felix has done some great work on Israel and Germany. There's some mutual traumas and mutual, I guess, glories beyond it, right? When it comes to the context of friendship. For me, what I find so interesting is somebody that is now turning to not focusing on insecurity as much. I mean, we talk about it as ontological security studies, but it's really ontological insecurity studies because most of these affects, most of these emotions are negative ones. You know, they're ones that none of us like to have: anxiety, discomfort, rage, you know, fear, revenge, so on and so forth, shame. But what's great about friends and friendship is that we can let our guard down a little bit. I think that's what's fantastic about friendship, and ideally even at the international level, so that we can be comfortable to create ontological security. We don't necessarily find it, but we create it together. So it's not just being, but it's becoming. And Felix's work, you know, deciphering for those of us that are, you know, not smart enough to understand it, Heidegger, for instance, right? The existentialist sort of aspects that are there that I think are important. But the short answer would just be, we look to the routines and the narratives to look at the ways in which friendship is shaped, but then also think about the opportunities that are there and not just the constraints. Dr. Rodriguez, how to help in cooperation and how is ontological security served even at the expense of like traditional security or rational interest? I think there's a couple of moments. One is that you can see this sometimes in particular treaties and agreements where, you know, this would be where we put it into conversation maybe with liberal theory, for lack of a better term, right? The ways in which we have, you know, we may not gain in a cooperative agreement as much as another, but we gain enough. And we gain enough knowing that we'll have the shadow of the future of working with them in the future on other issues. So we might sacrifice some traditional interest in the short term. And we're obviously going to need to have an identity, or at least hopefully have a narrative that leads to an identity that we're a faithful actor, that we're a good faith actor in those agreements, so that would lead to future cooperation. Well, they played ball with us in the past and even sacrificed a little bit on their own. So maybe that might lead to future cooperation. The literature on security communities is a place where you can see this, right? That it may not make any sense anymore for it to be in a security community, but you just keep staying in the security community because it's been so important for the individual that benefited from it in an ontologically secure sense. I remember I was on a panel in 2005, and there was a scholar, Peter Howard, I still remember him, who did a paper that was called Weekend at NATO's. And this was an oblique reference to Weekend at Bernie's, which was like sort of, you know, bringing the Bernie, who had this vacation house for these two, you know, 20-something guys that were vacationing, and he was dead, but they were just bringing him up for, you know, like to keep him going because they were having fun at the house. And that was the metaphor for NATO. It's like NATO was constituted in relation to, you know, the Eastern Bloc, but it's still around. So what's its purpose? Well, one of the purposes, right, amongst all the other things, whether it's like aggressive sort of encroachment on Russia's sphere of influence and everything else, one of the aspects is you feel good cooperating, so you keep cooperating. So I think those are the ways in which I'd answer your very astute question, but I'm not sure if I again did justice. And then Dr. Morales, I mean, you know, moral, humanitarian, or honor based. I'm not exactly sure which one is going to be most important. It's going to depend, obviously, on the actor and the subject. And it will also depend on which part of that spectrum they balance. Is it going to be more important for the self, or is it going to be important for the self and being recognized by others? In the case of Belgium, it was both. And that's why internal honor and external honor were both important. Was actually even, I think, more difficult to disentangle, but just as interesting to explore, is where any one of those compromises the other. So can you have honor-based motives or drives that are there to fulfill ontological security, but do really immoral things or really unhumanitarian things? And so we have seen that where we have notions of honor and honor cultures that can be very, very problematic from other normative considerations. So I think that's the way I'd answer it. And if you would have asked me it 20 years ago when I was defending my dissertation, I had the answer to it. But at this age where I am now, I can't remember what it would have been. But I know that you also put another question in the chat. So
Yes, there is another. There is another question that says that, for example, Professor Steele, sorry to put my questions, but really interesting. My question is how ontological security help us understand the resistance that armed forces often show or don't show toward an inclusion of women. Does gender integration identity of the military in ways that create ontological security? Wow, glad to my Mexican colleagues. Daisy Lopez. And the other is President Trump's, oh, here comes, actions certainly do not help reinforce the values of friendship and instead foster a deepening of nationalism and therefore a greater perception of insecurity. What comment would you make about this statement? Wow, I want to hear.
Oh, okay. I gotta let my subconscious work a little bit on Ambassador Blanco's question there, and I'll come right back to it. The question from Germany, from Dr. Lopez de Lara. That's a great question. I'm actually working on a couple of different angles and a couple of different studies on the makeup of at least the U.S. military over time. So I have a study on I call it militarized insecurity on the role of the military as both a subject but also as an object of U.S. ontological security and insecurity. So I've thought about this a little bit. So the question asks, does gender integration and the identity of the challenge the identity of the military in ways that create ontological insecurity? I mean, it depends on the military and it depends on the society. We're seeing a little bit of the opposite here in the United States in the reaffirmation of the masculinization of the military through the current administration. What is interesting, and this is something that I found in my work on naval ship museums with Jelena 𝒏𝒕𝒐𝒍𝒐𝒈𝒊𝒄𝒂𝒍, is you can see it go the other way, in which like hegemonic sort of subjectivity can be championed at these sort of local sites of memory and history, precisely because of pluralism, because you have an integrated military, because you have a diverse military. And so we would see this at some of these museums where having an integrated military was something that was a source of ontological security for at least some folks that were at these sites, because it's like, look at the United States as a pluralistic democracy. It's progressive sort of institution at the forefront of integration relative to other institutions in the United States, both in terms of racial integration, gender integration, not necessarily gender integration, but they tried to put that in there, reflects that the United States as a political community represents something that is different than everybody else. So it can cut in a couple of different ways. But I think definitely in the context of Germany that you're talking about, we would have to get to notions as nuanced as they would be of not just identity generically, but gendered identity and gendered masculinities, plural, and gendered femininities, plural. So hopefully that gets to a little bit of what you're asking. But I think this is something that we have to continue to keep exploring. And then Ambassador Blanco, no, absolutely not. I think one of the things that we have to do a little bit more to study is, and this would be the opposite of my answer to Professor Olsner, is that there are some political communities that are definitely motivated by friendship, and friendship can provide in that context, in that comfortable context, a sense of ontological security. But it could be the opposite. And actually, we see that quite a bit. That enmity, right, having enemies, provides ontological security. And that's where, physical security processes that we normally understand in terms of cost-benefit analysis, they don't do enough to explain enmity and a lack of friendship and a creating of enemies, as well as ontological security, or at least as good as ontological security. And so, this is something that is kind of captured conceptually in the concept of anxiety versus fear. Anxiety is this general sort of thing that a lot of ontological security scholars have talked about. But the thing about anxiety is we can't pinpoint one thing or one person for that general mood. So then what we do is we take that anxiety and we just find an object so that we can fear it or be enraged by it or be angered by it, even if there's no real good reason for it, because that settles us. Even though we're very, very animated, right? I think that's basically what's going on here, not just vis-a-vis former ally or current, but soon to be former allies, but with almost anyone in which we hear this rhetoric, which may not even be just rhetoric, but these narratives coming out of the current administration. So I really appreciate that question, Ambassador. And I don't think I've answered it nearly as fully as I should have or could have.
Okay, very interesting, Dr. Steele. Is there any question? ¿Alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? ¿No? Ok, bueno, voy a cambiar a inglés. I would like to introduce Gerardo Rodríguez Sánchez de Lara, who is the president of the Committee on International Security of the Mexican Association of International Studies, and he is going to say something. Adelante, Gerardo.
Primero en español y después en inglés. Muchas gracias a todos los que nos acompañan en Argentina. Andrea, Débora, saludos hasta Argentina. Muchas gracias por acompañarnos. Dainzú López de Lara, que nos acompaña desde Alemania. Al embajador García Blanco, me imagino que estás en la Ciudad de México. Y yo desde Puebla y Cholula, Luis Miguel. También agradecer muchísimo al secretario general de la MEI, al maestro Isaac Flores, que nos ayudó a organizar todo este evento. So I'm going to pass to English and then to French and German. Thank you, Dr. Brent Steele. It is an honor to have you in the Academic Committee on International Security at our Association of Mexican International Studies. This kind of stops, this kind of conferences enrich all about the top topics, the frontier studies of our discipline. So you were extraordinarily humble in terms of intellectual advancement of this new approach of our international relations discipline. I was saying to the rest of our auditorium, thanks for all our colleagues that are in Argentina, in Mexico, at Puebla, Mexico City, and also at Germany. Thank you, Dr. Brent Steele. We would love to have you maybe in some of our international congress in the next years. It will be extraordinary. I really want to thank precisely Luis Miguel Morales that know you at the ISA-AMEI conference recently this year in Huatulco, and maybe that's the way that also you met Andrea and Deborah, and we are maybe this is the first subcommittee, Isaac, of the International Security Academic Committee. So thank you really much, Dr. Brent Steele. I don't know if Isaac also can give us a final remarks from our association. Please, Isaac.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Brent Steele. Thank you very much on behalf of the Mexican International Studies Association and on behalf of Professor Claudia Marquez, our president, our current president. Thank you so much for being here today and joining us for this discussion on international security. So that's everything that I just wanted to say thank you, and thank you everyone for joining us for this activity.
Thank you all so much. This has meant so much, and it's great to see you all over Zoom, but it'll be even better if I get to meet or see you all again in person. I'm honored to do this, and thank you all for all of your work as well.
See you See you.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
Dr.
Have a nice
Brent.
weekend.
Yeah, have a
Bye-bye.
lovely weekend.
Yes. See you.